This cohort, we have 100 people who are joining us. We had just over 700 applicants for those 100 slots. And so we interview, I'd say about 250 of the applicants. In the third cohort, we had 40 people volunteer to interview candidates. For this cohort and our fourth cohort, we actually had 60 of our 100 people in the third cohort volunteer. The reason it's successful is because people want to be helpful to others. Almost 60% of the 100 people in this cohort were referred by somebody who's already in the community. The one core tenet of it is that I generally ask people to refer their one most talented friend who's startup focused and not on the market. I don't want to know the 10 people who you might text who are like casually interested. Nothing is random in Next. You can never waste somebody's time. Like that's a core tenet of how I operate. I don't want somebody to not be able to join a practice session because they didn't join the core. So in the session, we use a Miro board a template we've created that is kind of different color sticky notes. And they would put their two biggest on those two sticky notes. Music is an important ritual in my community. I run a lot of experiments every cohort because I think it's important that the community is evolving. If I just got to hit a button and like it was done for me, it's like, well, why am I doing this? Like, this isn't fun for me. So like, I like to keep it interesting every cohort.
So I have to ask about the behind the scenes part of the equation and the operations part of things.
We do, we have crazy amount of automations in the back end to be able to run the community efficiently. I had a no-code person actually join my team as a contractor to build all of our infrastructure and all of our automations before I even announced that we were doing this. Because I was like, if I'm doing this, it needs to have this level of infrastructure that I need to invest in upfront in order to be successful. Everything has to be automated to be able to run a high volume community. I've listened to many of the episodes of this podcast, and I feel like I've taken away at least something from every episode because I think that there are so many different ways to build community.
Welcome to Beginner Maps, where we interview operators of top community businesses so that you can replicate the best of what these community builders have already figured out. Today, I am thrilled to have Anthony Nardini with us. Anthony is the founder of Next Careers, which is a cohort-based community of senior-level individuals who are planning the next chapter of their careers. Now, before this, he was the program director at On Deck First 50 Fellowship that had a very similar mission. Now, for those who aren't familiar with On Deck, it was a company building the Stanford of the internet through various different fellowships, and Anthony was one of the first leaders at the company. So Anthony, across all of these programs, has helped more than 1,000 people, if I'm not mistaken, who are building their careers with his community memberships. Now, if you're building a fellowship or a cohort-based course, there is no better person to learn from. Thanks for joining us, Anthony.
Wow, thanks for such a great intro. Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Super thrilled to have you here. Can you tell me a little bit about Next Careers and who are the people who join it and what does the community do for them?
Of course. So Next is a group of tenured entrepreneurial folks who are in transition and want to be helpful to others. I'm sure we'll end up talking about like what each of those means throughout this conversation and kind of why that set of four, but it's designed for these kind of tenured operators in startups. Everybody is startup focused in some way, or evaluating startups is one option. And we bring this group together in a cohort-based format so they can help each other figure out what they want and then actually get that thing. And so it's really about kind of job search and supporting each other as we're figuring out that next chapter. It's the senior component, the like tenured component of it is because I want everybody to come to the table being able to share something. So this isn't designed for kind of the out of college person or the early in career person who's kind of figuring out their early career path. It's actually for the tenured professional who is at a moment of trying to decide, what do I actually want next? And then how do I get that thing? And so that's the group that we bring together.
I love this. And I was reading your LinkedIn post in order to prepare for this podcast, and this line really struck out to me, which highlights the importance of bringing tenured folks. You mentioned that each cohort brings together hundreds of senior folks who are already well networked, so they can help each other land their next gigs. And it sounds so wonderful. Like there are people who have these separate networks, and if they're combined and that they join forces, then theoretically they could help each other land their dream next gigs. And I think that's the promise here. So the key question then becomes, what does it take to create an environment, especially in an online setting, where these complete strangers are ready to just help each other out and form those, meaningful, deep connections?
Yeah, I love that. Great framing to the question. And so we bring together about 100 people at a time who are all in this moment of transition. I love that size. So each cohort, the target size is about 80 to 100 people. I want it to be big enough that everybody finds a crew. Like everybody has a little pocket within the community, but not so big it feels overwhelming. I think one of the core tenets, going to your question around like transformational experience in Next, at least, is vulnerability. So I think of it as like, as adults, we often see other people's career journeys, like on LinkedIn and their post about like, here's this amazing new job I got and stuff like that. And, or maybe we look at somebody's profile who's in a role and we're like, wow, they have done everything right. Like every single step builds on the next, and I can see this through line. And a core tenet of what we do in Next is kind of like normalizing the fact that nobody has their shit figured out. Like everybody is figuring something out. And I think if we can be self-aware about that and acknowledge it, and we can actually like help other people help us, like we can actually create an environment where people can help each other to actually figure out what that next thing is. And for people, especially like the most talented people who find it hard to talk about this, the fact that they're figuring things out in most like work settings or professional settings, because they're like, well, I have a reputation. I'm amazing. I've done all these amazing things. I can't be in a time of transition. It's really cool to bring them together because then they're able to support each other in a way that's really powerful, like a way that they're able to actually materially help. And so I think of a core tenet of what we do is this like vulnerability component of like, how do we put down our armor and actually create an environment where people can be themselves and can be real about like, here's what I know I want. Here's what I'm trying to figure out. Here was the challenge I had most recently. Here's how I've overcome it. And so that's kind of the framing of how I think about community specifically for this like tenured job seeker persona. And then the environment and the way that we do it has to start right at the beginning. So it's around, like, I guess this gets to the root of your question. So I think of it as like in our onboarding process, we're talking about our values. We actually start with confidentiality. So we have 5 kind of core values. The first one is around confidentiality, because in a group of job seekers, most of whom are still at their current job, confidentiality is super important in the group. And then it's all about mutual support and how do we like give back and share with others. And demonstrating that in the interview process, then in the onboarding process, then during kickoff, we spend a lot of time talking about values and the ways that people help each other. It creates an environment where people know it's okay. And just practically now, at this point, most of our new members come from referrals from existing members. So there's also this sense that they also know a little bit of what they're getting when they come in, which is helpful. And it was not the case when we started 1.5 years ago.
That is amazing. So I think this sets a really good scene about what we will be talking about in the interview, because you just mentioned this core tenet and how the community is essentially a way for people to be super vulnerable with each other in a way that they're not on LinkedIn and in the outside world. And this is a great tenet to have. And the meat here is like, how do you even do that? And I feel that is what we will be discussing in the rest of this interview. But before that, like the question is, why are you even doing this? Like you've been doing this for a lot of years now. Like first here at Nux, and then before at On Deck, it was a very similar mission. So how did you even come up with the idea of this entire like business model?
Yeah. So I don't have a background in this. I spent 11 years at Goldman Sachs after college. So I have this kind of like much more formal professional life, mostly in New York, 7 years in New York, then a few years based in London, but kind of with an Asia focused job, on the road a lot, and then moved to LA for my last couple of years. And in that last role, when I moved to LA, I started volunteering a lot. Like I started spending a lot of my nights and weekends with a whole host of different organizations, kind of as I was doing some like personal discovery. I'm like, what actually gets me excited? Like I stayed in a company in a job that I landed in after college, and then I stayed there for a long time. Like, what do I actually want? And there was an organization that I worked with very closely around mentorship. And it really inspired me to be like, this is something I actually want to spend my career on. Like I'm rushing through my day job to go volunteer at night. Like I need to take the guidance here. I'm like, what actually do I want? And so I left now about 5.5 years ago with this exclusive focus on career development and mentorship as like the thing I care about. And so I share that before answering your direct question around kind of On Deck and Next and the business model, because I think it's important context of like, I think we all can do lots of things, right? Like talented people are able to do lots of things. And so part of the core tenet of On Deck First 50 and then of Next is really around this belief that like people can be whatever they want. And so it's really like, what do I actually want? And then how do I leverage my networks and resources in order to get that thing? And so after Goldman, I spent a year and a half kind of building two businesses of my own, neither of which ended up kind of going too far. And in the second one, I was in the OnDeck founders community, like early COVID in one of the first cohorts. And I was kind of enamored with this idea of like, how do entrepreneurial people be so helpful to each other? And when they're figuring things out, and when OnDeck raised its seed round, this would have been like summer of 20, they did a community town hall, like a community, here's why we raise money, here's what we look to be in the future. And one of the things they shared is like extending into additional verticals. Like we were just founders at that point, like what other verticals does it make sense? I know then we launched dozens of verticals, but at that time it was just this one. And so I just pinged the CEO at the time, David, cold in our community Slack. And I was like, hey, I work in the job search space, happy to help you guys think about what a cohort-based program for job seekers would look like. And then that turned into like, well, why don't you come build this thing and like test it out as one of our first verticals that isn't for founders. So broadly had an amazing experience over the next couple of years at OnDeck and had about 1,000 people go through the job search program that I and the team built there. It was awesome. And so that's a long way to say the OnDeck had a business model around kind of paid membership, cohort-based community. And I think of OD50, which was the program they're in, OnDeck First 50. OD50 was leveraging that existing business model that they already created and testing out, could this work for job seekers? Like in the recruitment market, companies pay, job seekers don't pay. And so it was really a test. And we saw that it was one of our most successful verticals because there's this deep need for job seekers to like have an advocate, have somebody at the table. And so Next is in many ways a version of what I built at OnDeck, but it's designed as a small bootstrapped business as opposed to a big venture-backed model. Is that helpful? Did I hit the key points that you were asking there?
You did all perfectly. And I want to set the, give listeners a context about the business model itself, because not everybody might be familiar with it. So correct me if I'm wrong in any of this. So you run a cohort-based program, which runs for about 3 months. Is that right? We're on our fourth cohort. Our first 3 cohorts, we had a formalized 8-week structure. And now starting with our fourth cohort that kicked off a month ago, it's actually an ongoing structure. So we don't have a formal program length. It just supports people until they figure out what they're trying to figure out or land their next thing. Got it. That's amazing. And the cost is about $2,000 to join.
$1,800 to join.
$1,800. Yeah. So beautiful small business. And I love this idea of being able to help people through this really key transitionary moment and give them, as you said, like a seat, a partner who can help them figure out the next thing. So let us dive into how you're doing that and the specifics of how you're creating this environment in the community. Now, because you're one of the few people who I believe like truly understands how to create a transformative experience inside a cohort-based program. So this is gonna be like a mini masterclass for everybody who's trying to do that through, like, let's say a Maven course or one of those cohort-based courses, fellowships like you're doing it next. So okay, the first question is about the people that you let in the doors, and you intentionally keep a very high bar. In fact, I read in one of your LinkedIn posts that you welcomed like 300 members out of over 2,000 applicants. And that is like, a very slim, selection percentage. Yeah. And tell me, what is your process for filtering these people out?
Yeah. The selection process I actually think of as one of the most important parts of the community. So we are not trying to design Next to be everything to everyone. Like, absolutely not. We are the right thing for a hyper-specific group of people. And that group is tenured. So typically what that means is we're about 50% mid-career, which is 5 to 15 years experience, and 50% more tenured than that. So we're generally looking at executive level roles at startups. So it's designed for a tenured group. Everyone's entrepreneurial. So it is a group of people who build things and create things, and that's oftentimes expressed as startup focused. About 75% of our people are in startups already. About a quarter of our people are transitioning into startups, oftentimes from big tech or from consulting or finance or something like that. But it's this really like entrepreneurial vibe. And then a lot of transitioning founders. The post-founder decision making, whether there was a successful exit or not, is actually it's really complicated. And there's a lot of emotion. There's a lot of like personal identity is wrapped up in the business that we were building. And so in some ways, Next has become a home for that group of people. So in this cohort, about 20 of the 100 people in the program in this cohort are current founders transitioning out of their founder journey. And about a third of the group is actually deciding if they want to be founders as their next chapter. So it's kind of at that founder versus joiner decision making. So it's just like it's a very entrepreneurial group. So that's our second. Third is in transition. So it's people who are either actively on the market or they're getting ready to be on the market. Like they are preparing to figure out their next chapter. That's actually super important. This is not a networking group that with the purpose of broad networking. It is everyone has a purpose, everyone has a goal, and that actually brings together the transformative experience. That's like non-negotiable for me, is that like the timing has to be right. And then the fourth is they want to be helpful to other people. So this is a community setting, and it's really the reason it's successful is because people want to be helpful to others. So we'll meet people in the interview process who are amazing and they have these great backgrounds and all this stuff, but there's a lot of ego, or it just like it doesn't seem like we give them some chances, and it just doesn't seem like they really want to help other people or spend their time doing that. We're just not the right fit. And so I think to your point around selection criteria, I spend a lot of my time and our alumni volunteer interviewers' time on how do we ensure that we're screening on those variables, because selecting the right group is actually one of the most important things we do. So this cohort, we have 100 people who are joining us. We had just over 700 applicants for those 100 slots. And so we interview, I'd say about 250 of the applicants, and that's typically based on strength of background. So we're looking at the historical success someone has had. And then to go from the 250 to 100, we're in like the interview process. Everybody has an interview. This isn't apply and get in or just like ask to be in. This is everybody has a live interview. And during that, we're screening on those variables that I described of kind of tenured, entrepreneurial, in transition, and wants to be helpful to other people. So that's kind of how I think about like the basis of any transformational experience has to have relevant people to each other, where everybody views each other as a peer so that they can learn from each other. Is that helpful?
This is helpful, and it raises so many questions that I have. Okay, I'm gonna ask some.
Sure.
But the biggest one is, so you're interviewing all of these people. Like it's not just based on the application.
Correct.
So tell me about the logistics of this, because that is like a huge time commitment. How is it possible?
It is a huge time commitment, and it is a core part of the value prop that we have curated and vetted this group. And that's the value prop to each other, like other people in the community, that like everybody knows there has been an evaluation process, so they know that they're getting a curated experience. And then secondly, it is part of the value prop. We work with a lot of VC firms who recruit out of the community. And so the value prop to them of why they're willing and interested in spending their time with our community members is because they know they're getting a curated group as well. It's not just a random group of people. And so the curation actually is a core part of our value prop. So yes, it's a huge investment of time, but it's actually like, it's fundamental to the model. If we didn't curate, this wouldn't work. Like Next wouldn't work in this model. And so the logistics of what that looks like is the first two cohorts, I did all of the interviewing. So I did about 250 or so interviews for each of those cohorts in the generally like 4 to 6 weeks leading up to kickoff. So I'm just kind of in interviews all day. I experimented with 20 and 30 minute, maybe 20, 25 and 30 minute interviews. I have a mastermind group that I'm part of other community leaders. And there's some dissent amongst that group of like people liking shorter interviews because there's more throughput. I actually have the opposite, which is I like longer interviews. It allows us to have a real conversation. And I think increases the probability that if there's a mutual fit on both sides, then that person is like, I want to join this thing. And if I was just like rushing to the next thing, it wouldn't work. So first two cohorts, I did every interview. Starting in the third cohort, we started inviting volunteers from the community. So in the third cohort, we had 40 people volunteer to interview candidates. For this cohort and our fourth cohort, we actually had 60 of our 100 people in the third cohort volunteer to interview people for this cohort. And so I still do a lot of the interviews because it's important for me to I actually shape the programming every cohort around that group that's coming in, and I get those insights from the interviews. So it's pretty essential for me to be part of it. But then I now tap into a kind of this broader team of alumni who help with some of the interviews too. So that's what the logistics look like. It is a lot of work, but for me in this type of community, the only reason the business works is because of the heavy curation and the time we invest in it.
I think these interviews might be the magic sauce of your community. So I'm gonna hammer on this, pull on this thread
I think you're right.
bit more. So you mentioned two things that are really fascinating. One is that you do these interviews and these are 30 minutes long. And tell me what happens in these interviews? Like, do you like what are the
Mhm.
questions that you go in with, or can you give a structure that maybe another
Yes.
community builder could follow?
Totally. We have a whole, we've created a very detailed alumni interview. When you have teams of dozens of people that I'm like outsourcing decision making to some
Yeah.
degree, it's important that there's like a super structured, thoughtful process where people can learn about like, here's what a next interview looks like. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about this. And so first it starts with storytelling. Storytelling is the most important part of the job search. Communication skills are essential. And so when I'm doing an interview, I'm assessing their communication skills to start, because strong communication skills increase the likelihood that this person gets what they want. Their storytelling ability. Storytelling is the most important part of the search. So I'm actually already thinking about, in those first couple of minutes when I ask somebody to share their story, kind of like, is their story good? If it's not good, is it coachable? Oftentimes I actually give them direct feedback after their story and see how do they handle feedback. Feedback is a huge part of this community, and like peer feedback, how do we learn from each other and how do we all improve together? So there's a little bit of like feedback taking assessment during an interview. So that's the first part. I always ask the other person to introduce themselves first, and then I do an abridged version of my background story, and I'll typically highlight one or two things that I think are going to be exceptionally relevant to them. So the first part of it is really storytelling. That's going to be the first 10 minutes on both sides, getting to know each other. The next 10 minutes are typically more structured questions. I'm usually asking a version of like, why next? Like, why is this helpful to them? Why are they interested? Who do they know who's already been through the community? Things like that tend to be really helpful for me to understand. We ask that in our formal application, but we also ask it again during interviews. And then we spend actually a good amount of time on how can this person help? Now that I also share more about the community, more about our demographics, who's in it, that types of stuff. And based on that, I'll ask them, how can they help this group of people? And that is actually the most important thing that we ask, because it is about them understanding what we do and how they can contribute to other people's journeys. Because if we bring together 100 people who in their application, in their interview, in the onboarding process, in kickoff, are being set the expectation that this is about how they can help others, that's really powerful, because if we're all doing that, other people are also helping us and we're getting what we want out of it too. And so this expectation setting is really important. And I spend a lot of time thinking about the way that somebody answers a question. It's not just what they say, it's actually how do they say it, and does it seem like it's real? And then there's usually one or two other questions based on their background or based on whatever they've talked about, and then time for them to ask questions. I always want to make sure they have time to at least ask one or two questions, because that also helps me better understand their own thought process, where they are, the things that they don't know, maybe what are things that I should be talking about proactively if I'm hearing a trend again and again. So that's the like very inside baseball that I probably have never shared out loud of like, that's what we do in those interviews.
Yeah.
And every interview looks quite similar, so I can have a structured evaluation process on the back end, because then we have metrics that we evaluate based on.
Mm-hmm. I love this, and yeah, I think I've got a question, and this might be a dumb question that reflects my own insecurities more than your thought process. But when the third piece of it, when you're asking people like how they can contribute to the interview, like what I'm immediately thinking about is, at this point, this person has not paid you any money, and this person is
Correct.
like your potential customer. So it's like, if I were in your shoe, I would, my mind would almost try to convince them that this is what the community can do for you. So this is why you should pay us money and join us. But it's like an opposite script,
The
like
opposite.
flipping the script here. So
Yeah.
you can, like, why does it work? And I don't know, like, if I'm sure that a lot of people listening to this might feel the same tension in their heads when they actually get to these interviews. So
Yeah.
What's the thought process here?
So I think there are probably two different components to this. One is, I think the type of community matters a lot. Like every community is different, right? It has different personas, different goals, different levels of like how impactful is this in somebody's life. When somebody is looking for a job or starting to think about their next chapter, it's usually the thing they're thinking about more than anything else. And for most jobs, but especially in startups, jobs come through networking. Like I do negotiation coaching for everybody who's in the community. So I do, like, on an average week, it's anywhere between like 3 and 7 negotiation calls of like helping candidates advocate for themselves as they are in that final stage of the process. The majority of those roles that I'm helping people with are roles that were created for them. Like they're not through a random posting that they applied to or something like that. Sometimes they are, but more often they are like building a relationship, an introduction. And especially tenured startup job seekers know that, because they see it. They've hired for their teams. This is how hiring works in startups. And so I think what's really important for this particular persona is knowing that everybody's coming in with that same mindset of wanting to help others because they know that's where their next job is going to come from too. And so I think it's really important to highlight it. And then a component of that as well is like, if somebody doesn't want to do that, I don't want them in the community. I mean, like when you have, so just the math of this past cohort, like we had 700 people apply and 100 people that were accepting. Like there are lots of people who are like, I want to pay for this. I want this thing. But actually the curation and the relevance to what we do, like people's relevance to what we do is a super important part of it. So like, I don't want the person in the community who's just going to come in and try to take things. They're not a fit for me. That might be a fit in some other community. They're not a fit for this community. So there's this whole thing around like the type of community that we're building and the type of person and how we can support them and the importance of like them convincing us that they're going to be helpful to others. Because like negative people are way more negative than helpful people are helpful. Like you got to weed out the bad apples in the process. And then the second part is just the vibe. Like my community vibe is 100% about like how people help each other. Like that's the type of community that I like to be part of, that I like to build. And so if somebody's not interested in it, like, and they don't want this vibe, like they just want, I'm trying to mass apply to as many jobs as possible and like execute like this thing, like we're just not the right fit for them. They can find a better value somewhere else in like some type of mass application process that like we are not about. So yes, it's about them interviewing us and us selling them and describing what we do, but it's doing it accurately and ensuring that that person is actually a fit for our model. Because if they're not, they're just going to be unhappy. And I don't want unhappy community members. So like, I'd rather screen them out at the beginning and never have to like think about that again, unless we invite people to reapply for future cohorts, depending on the strength of their application or the context of the conversation. And so I do see actually a number of re-applicants. Every cohort, we have people who applied and made it somewhere in the interview process and then reapply for a future cohort. And that's a great indicator to me that like they understand the value and maybe now they're ready in a way that they weren't before. So yeah, is that helpful? Am I getting the root of your like question behind the question there?
Yeah, you did. This is beautiful. And yeah, I feel like you're coming from a, I don't know, there's like a really strong sense of confidence in the offer, in the environment that you're trying to create. And that's like, yeah, this is incredible. So I love this.
I think that's actually a great point that I think is helpful probably for anybody who's building community, is like understanding the value of the offering and then being confident in that value. And it's hard at the beginning. Like when I think of my first cohort last spring and early summer, I was bringing on 100 people and I was like, we're building it together. Like, please trust that this is going to be amazing. I've done it before. But it's very different when it's at the beginning versus like now we have 300 alumni. We have 100 people going through the program. Almost 60% of the 100 people in this cohort were referred by somebody who's already in the community. And so it's like people have a great experience and then want to tell their communities about it, their networks about it. And so I think that's I need to have the confidence in that. I actually increased the price point at the beginning of the year on the third cohort based on the demand that we were seeing. And then also based on the commentary. I do surveys very regularly, a lot of feedback that we collect from our current community members, and we adjust things on the fly. At one point I asked in a survey about value and like the value somebody's getting and kind of the monetary equivalent of that value and stuff. And the responses I got back were like, you are undercharging. Like I had so many responses like that, and I still get those. And so I feel really good about like, yes, this is an expensive, high ticket item, one of the most expensive things that somebody will purchase in a given year as a consumer. In almost all cases, this is covered by a consumer because it's themselves. It's not a B2B thing. We've had a few people as part of like separation agreements, they negotiate this and stuff. But for the most part, it is 99% personally paid. It's a very high ticket item, and I'm aware of that. But the value that somebody gets when they're at a moment of transition and like potentially interesting job or negotiating, like we do one-on-one negotiation support. It's like a very inexpensive in the grand scheme of the types of careers that like a tenured startup person is in. So I think knowing what's the value that you're delivering as a community builder and how do people perceive that is helpful. And there are some people who are like, I'm not going to pay for this. Like I can do it myself. And I'm like, great. That's how most job seekers do it themselves. This is just like, I'm offering, I think of like an experience that feels better for somebody who's in transition because they have peers, and the potential of making the process faster because they're getting introductions and insights that they wouldn't have gotten otherwise, and practice they wouldn't have gotten otherwise, and then helping them negotiate at the end. And so, yes, I think to your point, having confidence in like this is a really strong offering and its high value is important. And then we have a scholarship program as well to ensure that like amazing people who might not have the financial circumstances where they can pay for it are able to access the community. Because that's like, when I think of like my personal mission and like why I'm building this versus like, this is not the most profitable thing that you like going and build it for probably most communities, like going and building a product version of this or something else is definitely going to be like a more profitable venture. However, I like doing this because it's about the people and it's about supporting people, and like seeing that immediate support, that gives me a lot of gratification and joy. And so it's important that there's also an access component of like people getting help on the way in if they need it. And then I see actually many of those people pay it forward. We have a pay it forward scholarship fund that now is oftentimes our people who go through the program where scholarship supported actually pay it forward to support the next cohorts of people.
I love this, and this is such a wonderful model, and the entire strategy and the vibes behind it. And the one other thread that I want to pull on, you mentioned that how the first cohort was like, we're building this together. So talking about building it together, you also mentioned out of the 100 people in the last cohort, 60 of them volunteered for doing interviews for the next cohort. That is like a 60% interest rate in becoming like an interviewer. That is more than the email open rates that most people get on their email communication.
It's a really
Why are
special
so
group
many
of people.
Yeah, why are they like? What's their motivation behind this?
Yeah, I think I'm going to throw a question back to you real quick, and then I'll actually directly answer. When you think about your career journey and you think about any transition you made, do you remember the people who were helpful in that transition?
Yeah.
Like, do you can like, I imagine what I just called to mind for you was like some people who helped you at each of those moments of transition, right? We all need help when we're in transition. And so in many ways, we're building a community of people who want to be helpful to others at some of their most vulnerable moments in their career, when they're figuring out what's next. And when you get material help from a group of people like that, whether it's individuals, whether it's the program, whether it's the speakers, whether it's the masterminds or the curated connections, like when you get help from that, you want to help others, you want to pay it forward, you want to support other people who are also figuring it out. And there's also, so there's an altruistic component to that, right? Like we get value, and so we want to give value. There's another piece too of when happy to talk about, I spend a lot of time on referral cultivation. Happy to talk about that if you think that'll be interesting to your group. But the one core tenet of it is that I generally ask people to refer their one most talented friend who's startup focused and onto the market. I don't want to know the 10 people who you might text who are like casually interested or like don't really meet our quality bar. I just want to meet your one most talented friend. And I think the reason this applies to the interview process is because for every time we bring in another cohort of people, as long as that quality bar is kept the same height or higher, it means that it's actually accretive to everybody who's in the current network, because they know that the quality of the new people coming in are going to be really helpful to all of them. So I think that there's a self-interested component of they want to build the network. And the way that I do alumni interview pairing is it's not randomized. I don't do nothing is random in Next. And so the way we do alumni interviewing is we go through every candidate's background, and then we think about, is there an alum who matches some aspect of their background such that they're going to find that both people are going to find that this is a great conversation regardless of what happens with Next. And so it's actually a way that they're building their network at the same time. And I find that to be really effective because it leads to great conversations. It increases the probability that somebody leaves that conversation, a candidate leaves that conversation thinking like, wow, this is awesome. Like I'm going to meet more people like this. And then if there's not someone who I think is a great fit for an alumni interviewer, that's an interview I do. So like I'll do anybody who's maybe a little bit different or some aspect of their background. I'm like, I don't have the perfect person, or I have the perfect person, but I've already sent them a couple candidates lately, and I want to be respectful of their time, so it doesn't make sense. So the curation at every step of the way increases the probability that people want to engage with stuff like this because they feel like it's highly personalized to them, and they will get value from it at the same time as they're giving. That like mutual, we talk a lot in Next about how do we create mutually beneficial relationships. And so it extends to everything we do in the program, in addition to just like the way that people interact with each other one-on-one.
I love this. This is amazing. Like you're manually not only just interviewing people, but also curating those. I would have imagined that you would at this point, since you're already doing the hard work of interviewing every applicant, like you would probably just assign the interviews to every volunteer like randomly.
No, I think that this, I mean, truly some of this comes from like, I spent a decade working in like a very intense work environment where with like a very high expectations, and you can never waste somebody's time. Like that's a core tenet of how I operate. And so when I think about Next, that extends to everything we do, including our alums. Like if I'm inviting an alum to speak on a panel or do something, like, are they going to get something out of it? Is there something helpful to that? Like, how do we support people at every stage of their journey? Because alumni are still an important part of the fabric of our network, in addition to our current community members. So it's engaging them in the most thoughtful way we can, and definitely not wasting their time. That it's like wasting an alum's time is a surefire way that they are not going to engage in the future. And so I don't want to be in the position of doing that. So no, nothing's randomized. It's worth, if it's worth doing, it's worth doing well, is kind of my like operating mantra. And so that extends to alumni interviewing like really seriously.
I love this. I love this mantra. I'm gonna, make this my own and, try to follow this, I guess.
Great.
Okay, this is an amazing, like a mini market lesson in itself on the onboarding piece and the how to screen applicants and all of that process behind that goes before the program actually starts. Now, after the program starts, let's talk about the key pillars of programming that you've built into every cohort experience. Like right now, you mentioned that it's a continuous membership. But so maybe we can do a before and after here. But tell me, when you started, like what does the programming look like, and maybe like at a high level, like what are the key parts of that experience?
Yeah. I'll talk about structure, and then I'll talk about types of programs, just so like the structure I think will help ground us for the types of programming we do. So in our first 3 cohorts, we ran an 8-week program, in some ways like a little mini boot camp. We ran 5 to 6 live events per week for 8 weeks. So it's highly engaged, lots of stuff going on at all times. And then we would basically take a break in between cohorts. So we would rarely have programming in between those 8-week cohorts. And part of that, just for me, was also like I needed a break. Like, so the way that I had designed the program is that like I spent 4 to 6 weeks leading up to kickoff interviewing, admissions, like bringing people through. And then I spent 8 weeks running 5 to 6 live events per week, which as somebody who has built communities before, I know that like events take a lot of time and energy to do well. And so then I would just need a break for a couple of weeks, and then I would come back and like plan the next one, is truly kind of how it went. When I got to the 3rd cohort this past spring, it was my hardest cohort because I had now 200 alumni plus 100 people going through the program, and just a lot of demands on my time every day. And I was still running this like very high volume of events. And so I kind of took a step back in partnership also with my mastermind group it's actually also ex On Deck community leaders. We're still together and still meeting. And partly with the help of that group, really came up with a new structure to make it more sustainable for myself while still delivering the same or more value for community members. The 2 biggest pieces of feedback I got on our original model was that 8 weeks feels like an arbitrary amount of time. Like job searches and figure it out journeys are twisting and winding, and you just never know. And so 8 weeks is very arbitrary. And then second is there's so much programming and content that people couldn't consume the amount of stuff they wanted to consume. Because it's like, well, I have other things going on. I'm in a job, I'm doing these other things, and I can't attend like 5 or 6 hours of events per week. So kind of taking that feedback together and thinking about how does it work for me, I changed the structure for the 4th cohort to now be, we run about 2 live events per week plus a mastermind group for anybody who opts into masterminds. So kind of people have access to 3 things per week, and it's ongoing. So I don't have the 8 weeks on, 8 weeks off structure that I had. So it's roughly the same. It ends up being roughly the same amount of total programming, but it's now more spread out. And the reason we can do that, and now the feedback that I'm getting is actually even more positive on this model than the old model, but we can only do it because we now have 100-something sessions in our content library that are all on demand when people need it. So like I couldn't do something like this in the first cohort because if somebody needed negotiation content or they needed interview content or they need something else, they need it when they need it. And now it's all on demand. And so now I have the luxury to be able to do sessions live that I think are hyper relevant to this group, are going to be super interesting. So that's kind of the structure. I'll talk about the programming types in a second. Does that all make sense, or anything there?
Yeah, it does. It makes a lot of sense. Thank you so much for breaking down the before and after picture like so beautifully.
Cool. The types of programming have stayed roughly consistent throughout the past 1.5 years since original conception. So those have a couple different buckets. One is what I would call job search skills. So these are workshops, these are practice sessions that help someone be better figuring out what they want and getting that thing. So it could be, I have a framework that I use called MSSR, Mission Sector Stage Role. It could be like designing your next chapter with intentionality. Could be storytelling, could be interviewing, could be negotiation. Like these are things that are helpful to somebody as they are getting their next thing. And we do live workshops that typically have breakout sessions, and we do practice sessions, like actual sessions that are just nothing, but like a series of breakout rooms to help people practice and implement the things that they're getting peer feedback from different people. So one bucket of programming is job search skills. Second is VCs. So we've had probably 36 or so VC firms come in the past year and a half, and we have different formats for that. But what we do now mostly is we have themes, and we have some larger firms, some niche firms. So like we did a session a few weeks ago with the heads of talent from Battery and Excel, two like very big and very broad VC firms that are amazing firms. And they talked about how job seekers can best leverage VC firms in their process. The number one question I get asked. So I was like, let's bring in the experts and have them talk about it. And they have really wide portfolios that then our community members can express interest in afterward. But then last week we did a session on the state of health tech, and we brought in 3 health tech investors from different firms, one more generalist firm that has a health tech practice being Pair, and then two health tech specific firms. So my goal in these types of sessions is how do we provide somebody with insights that they wouldn't get elsewhere? Like they're getting this interesting view into what's happening across startups and venture. And then afterward, our community members can express interest. So it hopefully helps with some introductions and things like that. So that's kind of our second bucket, is very specific to us being VC programming. And then the third is going to be connection. And so that's going to be mastermind groups that we curate each week. That's going to be curated connections, like one-on-one connections. And that's going to be other sessions that the purpose is around bringing people together. So I'm actually, right after our recording today, I'm hosting a session that I call Quick Asks, which is an outgrowth of something that we did at On Deck that I do each cohort. And it's an opportunity to bring people together to share their 2 most important asks that they're trying to figure out, and then get live crowdsourced feedback on ways the community can help them. We use a Miro board to make it efficient, and then we build time into the session to action those suggestions. And this is something that like I would never do at the beginning of a cohort, for instance, because then it would feel super transactional. That's not my vibe. But now when we do it a month in, everybody knows each other. And they're like, oh my God, like Jill is recommending this great contact. Like that's super valuable to me. So our third bucket of programming is around connection. And that could be in small groups, that could be one-on-ones, that could be in these orchestrated sessions. But the purpose is how do we demonstrate the value of community? So job search skills, VCs, and connection.
I love this. Yeah, this is really helpful. And I want to double click on 2 of these specific type of sessions that you mentioned about. And
Sure.
if you can give us, detailed, paint a picture of what those sessions look like. The first one is the practice sessions. You mentioned is where people go into breakout rooms and they practice some of the skills that you might have taught them in the workshops and other. Yeah. Can you give an example of something that people might practice?
Definitely.
And how does that go?
Yeah. The current one that we're doing now, so I have some like themes that we use. And so right now we're in a storytelling theme. So sometimes I'll lead a workshop. Sometimes we'll have external coach lead a workshop. I led one last week on storytelling. And so next week we're doing a practice session where it is an hour long. In that one, I usually have 2 or 3 breakouts during an hour-long session. And then those breakout rooms are usually 2 or 3 people, depending on what I'm trying people to understand. In storytelling, we're going to do 3-person breakouts and I think 2 breakout sessions, so longer breakouts, because I want there to always be an observer and a timekeeper, because the way we tell our story is perceived differently by different people. So having time to share feedback across a group is actually really valuable. And so we'll design those sessions in that way. Usually the first breakout that we do, a breakout that we do during a core workshop, and then the first breakout during a practice session have some curation component to them. So we're planning in advance and then executing during that session some relevance to each other, like the people who are going to be a breakout room. Sometimes that's sector interest, sometimes that's career stage, sometimes we think about gender. Like we'll look at some variables and then bring people together in a breakout that we think are going to be hyper relevant to each other. In a practice session where we're also doing, I usually will bring people back from the breakouts. I'll then facilitate discussion for a few minutes, like having people share a couple of their learnings or something they heard that was helpful feedback for them, because that's going to be helpful to other people in the group as well. So the turn on the breakouts is quite fast. It's only a couple minutes. So there's usually less curation on the second or third breakout during a session. But the entire session is designed around practicing something, some skill. And some of those sessions, if they are on the back of a workshop that had something shared, a framework shared, the first breakout room, oftentimes I will have my own breakout and allow community members who didn't attend the core session they can join my breakout where I'm going to do a quick version of the framework, because I don't want somebody to not be able to join a practice session because they didn't join the core. I want them to get the main elements of the core session in that first quick hit, and then jump right into another breakout room or two so that they can immediately implement it. So I don't do homework. I don't do pre-work, because this is a really busy group of people. And if they're able to carve out 45 minutes or an hour for a session, I want them to be able to get value from that, even if they didn't attend something beforehand.
It's a really power-packed session, I have to say. Now, one question that I think about when I'm, considering this type of a session is, how do I ensure that these members who are essentially students who are also learning about this framework for the first time, how can I ensure that they give each other the right kind of feedback?
I think a couple things come to mind there. One is curation. This goes back to curation of the group. Everybody in this group has been a hiring manager, an interviewer, on the receiving end of networking calls. Like, it's an experienced, tenured group of people. And so I think if we were working with all young people, this would actually be much harder, or maybe if our group was more mixed experience levels. But the fact that everybody's mid-career or executive level, like, there's no expert. Like, everybody has been on the other side of the table. So you might, as somebody receiving feedback, you may be like, okay, I think that, like, I gravitate toward that. Like, you don't have to accept the feedback that somebody gives, right? Of course, it's your decision. But I think everybody's opinion has value because everybody's experienced. So it's the first piece to the answer is actually around the curation matters here, just like it does in every other thing that we do in Next. And then the second thing is the mastermind groups that we have typically every Wednesday. We provide prompts for many of those masterminds, especially in the first couple of months of the group's meeting. And so we provide prompts to the group the day before, and so that they can choose to use the prompts or not, but it at least like anchors the discussion in something. If we had a workshop or a practice session about a topic, that's the theme of that mastermind group for that week. So then, in addition to the breakouts where you're getting quick feedback, you're then reinforcing those same concepts in a small group format where you're consistently meeting with the same people every week. So you've had these trusting relationships built where you can kind of sanity check, like, hey, here's what I'm thinking about. Or like, will you guys give me feedback? Like, you've heard versions of my story. What do you think I should do next? And so I think that those two things together matter, the curation as well as the reinforcements on a recurring basis.
I love this. Wow, you're doing a lot of, like, it's hard work running this community. I can understand. Like, it's a lot of manual labor, like connecting the right people and at every step of the way. So this is how are you? Yeah.
I guess my reaction to hearing that is like, yes, it is. And I actually think that that's why this is designed as a $5 paid membership community, right? So I think that there are lots, like, job search is a very saturated space. There are tens of thousands of coaches. There are probably like dozens to hundreds of programs that do something around job search, right? Most coaches have some type of program that they bring people into. I think what we're doing is quite unique because it targets this really specific group of people who recognize that for what they need, network is going to be the thing that gets them what they want. And so it's hyper specific and delivers on the network, tends to be really powerful in helping people get whatever they're trying to achieve. And so I just wanted to like react and share that because I think that that's why we do this collection of things. And I think if there was like a free or low dollar version of this, I think that can totally work. But then you're kind of choosing which of these items can you actually deliver on, right? Like, you probably in a free or low cost version just wouldn't be able to get this level of execution. So I think you're choosing a path. Every community builder, right, chooses a path on like, what am I delivering? Who is it for? How does it make any money? And how do you build it into some type of business or whatever it is? So I think that my version of it that resonates with me is like high production value in order to ensure that we're delivering on an amazing experience.
I love this. And the other session that you mentioned that was really interesting, and I would love for you to do like a quick dive into the structure of it, was the big ask session. So you use a Miro board, and there are like, give us the structure, like a rundown of what
Totally.
happens there.
I actually it's called quick asks, but in the future, I'm going to call it big asks because that is better. That's a good one. So thanks for suggesting that. Immediate value for me. So in this session, we use a Miro board a template we've created that is kind of different color sticky notes. I imagine most of your listeners are probably familiar with Miro boards. And so different color sticky notes. Everybody on the template, there are places where people can put their name. And then under their name, they pick 2 of purple sticky note, like 1 color sticky note. And then they would put their 2 biggest asks on those 2 sticky notes. And so we have a few minutes that are orchestrated. I put music on. Music is an important ritual in my community. And so we'll have some music on. They kind of put down their asks for a couple minutes. Then we have a period that's usually about 15 minutes where everyone goes and reviews everyone else's asks and uses the green sticky notes, like the other color sticky note. They put it underneath somebody else's purple sticky note, and they say, like, I'm Anthony, I can help with an intro to this company, or I'm happy to do mock interview practice with you, or whatever I'm happy to help you think through this thing you're trying to figure out. And they make an immediate offer to somebody else's ask. And then we have a brief period of reviewing the offers people have made on our asks, because an important part of this too is, like, just because somebody offers something doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to be the best use of time on both sides. So we want to acknowledge that within the community and be open about it. And so people change the color of their offer sticky notes to say, like, oh, okay, 5 people offered help on this thing. These 2 or 3 are actually the most relevant to me. So I'm going to change the color on those sticky notes. And now that changing of the color is actually a commitment on both sides of, like, something was asked, something was offered, and both sides are going to do it. And then we actually live in the session, the last, like, call it 15 minutes of the session, are reserved for actioning the offers. So for somebody to be like, oh, I offered this intro, this person changed the color of it, meaning they're accepting the intro, and now I'm going to go ahead and make that intro. Like, we're reserving time to action the offer during that session. So the objective is, how do people come away from a 45-minute session being like, okay, this helped me clarify what my 2 biggest asks are, and then get immediate suggestions and implementation of those suggestions on ways that the community can help me get the things that I need. And I'm doing it for others as well. Like, I'm helping other people in the community at the same time. So it feels good in that way too.
This is amazing. And yeah, is this something did you come up with this, or I've never seen this in any other community that I've been part of?
Oh my gosh, probably in the early on-deck days, we did a lot of experimentation, like, across all our communities, and we're all under the same umbrella, so we're all learning from each other. So, like, we'd put together docs being like, this worked for me, here's what I did differently, or here's what I tried. And then the next community, the next person would pick it up and they'd be like, okay, that was cool, but, like, I'm going to adjust this thing and try something else. So at this point, I wouldn't be able to remember, this was many years ago, but, like, it came out, it was an outgrowth of that experimentation process across communities. And lots of people experimented with different versions of this idea of, like, how do you harness energy around connection in a live session as opposed to async. A lot of what we do is async. We use Circle as our platform, but this is like a live version. And this was the part that resonated most with me. Like, this was the version of it that I was like, I'm seeing this work. I ran 9 cohorts of a very similar program out on deck with 1,000 people. So ran lots of experiments to really hone what works and what doesn't work. And this version of the session for this type of persona works really well.
And then talking about experiments, you must still be doing experiments. You feel like you're doing surveys, and so what does an experiment look like to you? And yeah, how do you determine the success or the outcome of the experiment?
Yeah, so I run a lot of experiments every cohort because I think it's important that the community is evolving. Right. And we're learning from our members. And if we're bringing cohorts of people together, every cohort needs something a little bit different. And so the programming and the types of things we do needs to be responsive to that group of people, not just like, here's what we did in the past, we're going to carbon copy it. And then, if I'm honest, the second part of why I do so many experiments, and I'll share the types of experiments in a moment, is for me, like, it has to stay fun and interesting. Like, I am as a professional, I am attracted to new things. I like variety. I like to create things. And so if I was like, oh, this is my 4th cohort, it's kind of the same as the first one, I hit the button and it worked. We have crazy amount of automations in the back end to be able to run the community efficiently. But it's like, if I just got to hit a button and, like, it was done for me, it's like, well, why am I doing this? Like, this isn't fun for me. So, like, I like to keep it interesting every cohort. So I'm like, I can give you some examples of types of experiments I'm running. So I already described this in detail earlier, but, like, I'm changing the structure of this cohort of 5 to 6 live events per week for 8 weeks, now to 2 or so live events per week on an ongoing basis. That's an experiment. Immediate feedback on that has been super positive. So I'll still be collecting more data points to make sure that I'm committing to it, but it has been super positive from the group. And so if it wasn't, or if it was more mixed, I actually would revert back for our next cohort to the old model. So that's actually a pretty big change. Now, I didn't message it to our community members as like, we're making this crazy crazy big change,
Right.
right? I talked about it more as like, here's what we learned and here are the ways that we're adapting. And I'm excited to get your perspective on if it's working or not. And so that's an example of a larger change. Another change that we made in the first two cohorts, we brought in VC firms one at a time, and we basically give them a slot. We'd be like, this is the slot for this firm, and they'd usually have an investor and a talent person together because we have a mix of talent and investors that come through next. And so we'd have them together typically, and then they would do a 45-minute session on like, here's who we are, here's all this great stuff about us, and then they'd take some questions. And if I'm really honest, after a few of those, everybody kind of sounds the same. It just like wasn't interesting enough for me personally to listen to. And I was like, if it's not interesting enough for me, it's probably not interesting enough for the group. So we did that. We changed that in the third cohort. We ran an experiment where we didn't do any single, sometimes we would bring in one firm at a time, but if we did, it always had a theme to the discussion. So most often we'll have two firms together and they'll have a theme. So this cohort, we've done leveraging VC talent teams as a job seeker. We've done state of health tech. We have on the horizon state of AI, state of tech investing. And we're doing a session in a couple of weeks with Initialized on kind of the reality check, like what's going on in the hiring market. And so we'll try to create these interesting dialogues. And that has been a huge success. So that's an experiment I ran from cohort 2 to 3 on like, we're completely changing the way we do VC engagement in live sessions, and immediate feedback on that was huge success. So I would say like, I think of every time a few things I'm going to change, oftentimes through feedback from community members on things that could be improved. And then I pick a couple of those things and I make those changes. And then I wouldn't say, you asked about measuring. I wouldn't say I like measure, like I don't, it's not as structured. Like I don't, it's not like a giant team. So it's not like I need to like communicate to all these people. Like I'm getting a sense immediately, and I'm asking in my one-on-ones with community members too, like, how do you like this? Is this a good idea? And then I'm either re-underwriting and committing to that idea or that change, or I'm reverting back. And I do a handful of those things every cohort.
I love this. Okay. Now, this is a lot of things. Like, this is mind-blowing. The kind of the sheer number of things and the work that you're putting in behind this cohort is amazing. So I have to ask about the behind the scenes part of the equation and the operations part of things, because you have to be super streamlined on those things in order for this to work again and again. So there are three parts to it, I feel. One is the tools part, and then another is the team structure part. So let's start with
What's the third?
tools.
Wait, are there two or three? I thought you said there were three things.
Yeah, there were. Yeah, I think let's go with two, because
we'll go with those two.
Yeah.
Sounds good. Totally agree that those are super important. So on the tools side first, I think so. OnDeck honestly was amazing. Like just really like it's still a huge part of my text everyday friends. Our community members from OnDeck, our staff members from OnDeck. It's a huge part of my life. And still, I haven't worked there in years. Like my part of the community doesn't exist anymore, and so, but it's still a huge part of my life. And the reason I share that first is because I think that there are a lot of learnings from the OnDeck chapter for all of us that were part of it, but there are also a lot of things that like OnDeck was exceptional at. One of those was recognizing the importance of infrastructure. I think that I talk to a lot of people who are starting communities and are trying to like understand how to build something from scratch. And I think people underinvest in infrastructure or don't realize the importance of it, of how critical it is for community success. So a month before I launched this community last April. I was working at a VC firm leading their talent function after OnDeck and before starting Next. And I had a no-code person from OnDeck actually join my team as a contractor to build all of our infrastructure and all of our automations before I even announced that we were doing this. Because I was like, if I'm doing this, it needs to have this level of infrastructure that I need to invest in upfront in order to be successful. The community will not be successful if I don't have the infrastructure. And so what I mean by infrastructure is kind of two different buckets. One is admissions and one is community, like the community management side. So on the admission side, if I'm being totally honest, for my type of community, it's actually more important to invest in admissions infrastructure, especially for high volume communities. Like if it's a community where it's like, I'm bringing together 15 people and I have 30 people interested, like just run that on a G sheet. Like you don't need to invest in infrastructure. The first cohort, we had 550 people apply. I had 4 weeks I had given myself to evaluate and vet those 550 people and bring on 100 people. I think we had 98 or 97 in our first cohort. So like, it's a really condensed period of time. If I didn't have systems and infrastructure around admissions, it just wouldn't be possible. And same thing now, as our application volume has grown, our selection process has become more complex with alumni interviewers and things like that. So that is all Airtable based for us. It's basically using an on-deck model of everything is in Airtable. So all of our admission infrastructure lives there. And then we were using Zapier, but we've since moved to Make just from a cost perspective. So everything, we have dozens and dozens of automations in Make for every scenario, such that I can use Airtable as my home base for decision making, and then everything else happens behind the scenes, and I don't need to get involved. So that's from all of our applications end up in Airtable. We have multiple parts to our applications that we collect information regardless of if somebody completes an application or not. That also flows through to Slack so that I'm notified when something happens. In Airtable, I can review, or somebody on my team can review those applications. We can assign someone to an interviewer. We can trigger that interview directly from Airtable. All the emails just happen on the back end. If we're moving somebody forward to an offer, or that all happens directly in Airtable. If they pay, like once they confirm that they're joining and signing up, they pay through Stripe, that triggers a notification in Slack. It moves them in Airtable from pending offer to confirmed community member. It triggers an automatic email, a welcome email that also asks for referrals. And so everything has to be automated to be able to run a high volume community or high volume of application community. So that's on the tools for admissions. Tools for community running the community. Our community management on our side happens all in Airtable. So we're still using Airtable. It's a different Airtable base, community members versus admissions, but it's all still Airtable based. And then for community facing, we use Circle as kind of the all-in-one platform. And then we use some other kind of more basic and standard tools for other things. Like our survey, we do a lot of surveys. That's through Tally. Our admissions application is also through Tally. It's just so much cheaper than any other tool that's on the market. And so we use Tally, and then we use Zoom for live events, a couple other tools. But those are kind of like the tools. And before I talk about team, does that all make sense? Anything that would be helpful to dig into in more detail?
Yeah, the things like you mentioned that you basically set up the infrastructure before you even announce the community, and that is like, that goes to say how critical your infrastructure is. So you've mentioned you have like some key automations that happen on the admission side. What are some of the key automations that you have put on the community side of things?
Interestingly, we have way fewer automations on the community side. The community tends to be it's fewer people, and so it's much more customized. So we actually probably do more, like we use Streak as our mail merge tool. And so we do a lot more of like custom mail merges for different things. Like we send a newsletter every Friday, that's all custom. I don't use any of the Circle like digest or anything like that. I don't want a tool or an automation that is curating something that goes out to my members. I want to be able to curate what is in that message to make sure it's high value up for their time. So we write that every week. That goes out on Fridays. Then it just mail merge. I'm trying to think of automations in the community. Oh, I guess things like our community members can express comp benchmark data that goes through a survey, which then gets pumped into a Slack for us. When we have a survey response, especially for our larger feedback surveys, we use a series of automations to move that data directly from Tally response into Airtable so that we can analyze the data, the feedback data, together in Airtable and preserve it. Our curated connection infrastructure is through Airtable, where we can trigger connections through that. So I would say there are a number of things that make our lives easier on the community side, but actually more of our automation and core infrastructure exists on the admission side, because going back to the point, like curation is such an important part of what we're building in next, that like I need to make that as efficient as possible.
I love this. This is amazing. Okay. Now take me to the team behind this whole machinery.
Yeah. So there are two of us. I have one full-time person who works with me.
Crazy.
And well, thanks. It's a lot. Like this is not, I think there are lots of ways that people build communities, and there's no right or wrong. It's just like, what's the choice we're all making? This is not a side project for me. This is not like I'm doing this because I'm doing all this other consulting, or I'm in a job. Like this is my full-time thing. I do nothing but think about this all day, every day. I'm like, how do we deliver an amazing experience? And then I have somebody on my team who helps with that as well. The bifurcation of responsibilities is primarily around operations. And so a lot of our, how do we implement something and how do we execute something will happen with a member on my team. And that frees me up to be able to spend more of my time with our community members, planning with our speakers, with our sessions, delivering a lot of our sessions. And then when delivering those sessions, there's also a bifurcation that like I always have another person on that Zoom with me, because they're responsible for just different things every session. So like they're making sure we're recording, they're dropping speaker bios in the chat if there are external speakers, they're hyping up the room, they're managing the Slido. We use Slido as our Q&A tool. So they're managing the Slido, they're sending it in the chat, they're pinging people to, if We record attendance so that we can then track attendance and engagement. If somebody has like Zoom user or something like that, our operations person is checking like, who is that person? Make sure they're turning on their video, make sure we're recording the name. And so yeah, I would say there are a lot of steps in everything we do. Nothing is like, oh, let's just wing it. Let's try it. But it's definitely a lot. And that's also why it is a paid community. Like it's a different level of commitment when somebody, like if somebody's paying, I want them to be like, wow, I'm getting a ton of value from this. And so it's important that we deliver that value in a really high touch way.
I can really like understand when you say that it's a high commitment, but also like a high value. I feel like I can really understand this because I was a part of one of the on deck cohorts, like the community builders cohort, and so I experienced this, and that is why I can.
She's the best.
Yeah, so that is why I feel like I can really understand the power of what you're saying, like what you're building, and the impact that it can have. So like so much respect for everything that you're doing. This is amazing.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
Okay, now let's talk about the business, the money side of things. So you mentioned this thing like in passing at the beginning of the interview that all the new applicants, new members who are joining the community, they are through referrals. And
Many,
not
right? Not all. Yeah,
okay.
A bit more than half of community members are through referrals. Yes.
Okay, that is still crazy. So tell me, let's talk about the referral side of things and how do you, how have you managed to get so many, like this is a high ticket community, as you mentioned, and there are a lot of reasons why, people would not want to join this, and yet they're not only joining it, but they're also referring other people to it. So
yeah,
how is that happening?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier that our number one value is confidentiality. It does make public declarations of people in the community a little challenging because if I'm at a company and trying to leave that company, I am certainly not broadcasting that I'm in a job seeker community. And I saw this at On Deck in my vertical. I see this in Next. And so I need to be I have very few of our community members who are public about their involvement, even after they land their new job. It's kind of like MBA admissions. Almost everybody who goes to a top school has an MBA admissions counselor who helps them. Very few people ever want to say, I had help in this process. But that's the reality. So that's the same thing on kind of job search side, especially like if I'm getting an executive role at a startup, like very few people are public about their involvement. And so I need to be more creative in other ways that I can help the right people know about us. And so referrals are the main way we do that. And they're not through public channels. So most times when people talk about referrals, they're like, hey, can you post about us? I ask some people after they land a job, especially if I was particularly helpful in their negotiation or they landed the job through Next, they might post about us, but for the most part, it's all private. And so I ask people first for referrals in many places. So I think that that's important too, of like capturing referrals when someone's thinking about someone, and that's going to change over time. However, I rarely ever make I want to minimize any time that I'm making an ask and just sending somebody a note saying, send me a referral. I want it to be part of something else that they're doing, and especially part of a give, like something we're offering. And so I ask people for referrals right after they sign up. They get an email from us welcoming them to the community. I ask in our onboarding survey, we do a very detailed onboarding survey to learn more about our members, such that when we have now data from the application, data from the interview, data from the onboarding survey, we know this group of people and what they're looking for and can design a program around them. We ask for referrals in that. We ask for referrals we do kind of a 1 month check-in and a 2 month check-in survey. We ask for more formally in those circumstances as well. So we're asking for referrals often, as well as anytime we launch a new cohort, we're typically asking. And that sounds like a lot, especially when I say it out loud like that. However, I would say I see that the people who are on our minds at different times change. So if there are 2, 4, 6 weeks in between asks, different people who are on our minds, right? And so I ask many times. I ask in the way that I mentioned earlier, most typically, which is like, who's your most talented friend who's on the market? Because quality bar is the most important thing to me. And then in some situations, especially in our welcome email, we actually give them a little couple sentence blurb that they can post in other communities they're part of. Oftentimes they're work alumni communities. So most of our people have worked at amazing companies before. Most of those companies have Slack communities or other communities. And so it's a way that they can share. And if we host live events, public events a few times a year. So most of the time when I'm giving those blurbs, I'm actually referring people to the live event as opposed to saying, just join this community. So there's a give component to it. And then the last thing I would share about referral cultivation is that we send forwardable emails. Forwardable emails are a job seeker's best friend. Like I encourage all of our community members to use them as part of their search. It's a huge part of what we do. How, in addition, I need to practice what I preach. And so for referrals, the most common way that we'll ask somebody for a referral, and then we'll look at that person to make sure that their profile matches what we're targeting in the community. And then if it does, we'll send them a forwardable email that they can just hit send to their friend to be like, hey, you should take a call with Anthony. And we reduce friction on referrals such that they're in my queue. They're not in an alumni interviewer's queue, and they go straight to an interview. They can submit an application, but they don't need to submit an application in the same way because there's already this first level of vetting, and the interview questions will just be a little different if we need to learn more about the person. So that's kind of my referral. I spend a lot of time and energy on aspects of this process, but that's how we're able to have such a high referral rate.
Love that. And okay, everybody listening to this must be thinking, give me the forwardable email template that you're using here.
Sure, happy to share that. Yeah, I don't know that it's magic, but happy to share.
Yeah, so tell me, like, what what does that look like? How does that be?
So it is highlighting a little bit about what we do, the people who are in it, like we never share names of people who are in things, but like the types of people who are in it, like giving them some like rough idea of like it's designed for you, like your peers are part of this thing. And then it's typically I could be inviting them to a conversation with me so we can explore on both sides, and or just letting them know about an upcoming event. So like we did an event in late June, early July, I forget, in the lead up to this cohort. I usually do one public event in the lead up to each cohort recruitment cycle. And I think we had like 250 people register for that event. And a lot of that all comes from friends of the community members. And so that's kind of how we'll do it. But it isn't, I guess it's a softer, you're probably catching this throughout the conversation. My vibe is not like I don't want to ever be in a position where I'm doing a hard sell or I'm pushing somebody to do something. Like that's just a way to like capture somebody's money and then poorly deliver because they're not going to be happy in the community. So like, I don't want that person. I only want the people who are hyper relevant. So the tone of anything like a forwardable email or a referral ask or a referral push is all going to be around like, are there other people who we can help, who we can support, who would be strong community members and pay it forward? Because at every stage we're doing that. And I guess the last thing to mention is I don't ask for referrals in the application. Many communities and companies do this. I don't, because so many hundreds of people who apply are not the perfect fit for us. And so if they were encouraging their friends, like it just, like I don't know if those are going to be the people who I'll want, and then I'm just creating more noise for myself and more work on the application volume. So that's an intentional choice that I do not ask for referrals until somebody has been vetted and is part of the community. Like that's the group that I want to ask for referrals from.
I love this. This is like such an amazing conversation about how to create a really thoughtful and curated community experience and the fellowship that I don't think I've had any other member on the podcast talk about their membership in the way that you've talked about, because you've created like a really unique offering. So I want to just thank you so much for putting out this podcast and giving us all of this magic sauce. This is
of course
so cool.
I'm happy to. It's very fun. I talk to a lot of friends about aspects of this and learn from a lot of people when doing it. A lot of the model I use is definitely the original on-deck model that I've adapted for my audience and what works for me. And I would say I've listened to many of the episodes of this podcast, and I've found that even the ones that are not on the surface relevant, like for instance, you might have somebody on who runs a free community, or somebody who has maybe a community that's a little more closely tied to a product. Like there are so many different types of communities, and at the surface, many of them might not be relevant to what I'm building in Next. However, I feel like I've taken away at least something from every episode because I think that there are so many different ways to build community, and I think that's part of the cool thing of doing this together. Of like learning from each other. I would say, I know that you had prompted me for places that I go for information. And if I'm really honest, I'm not really active or part of any communities. I have found that my style of community is like super unique and specialized. And I was previously part of some places, but I found it to be just less helpful for me because I didn't find my crew. And part of that is on me. Like I didn't spend the time to invest to find that crew, right? Like that's all like that is what community is, right? Have to invest the time. And instead, I still have a very large network of on-deck staff members. And the cool thing there is like at one point we were running 35 verticals. So you have lots of people with different styles of community. And then learning from that group of people tends to be really helpful. So I'm in a mastermind group with people who used to run on-deck communities and are now running other types of communities. And then I spend a lot of my other got a lot of time catching up with people from that ecosystem. And so I would say I found more of like a peer group for my style of community there. But if anybody listening knows of a spot that I should be spending more time, I would really appreciate that and love that. I just I've joined and then not participated in. So left a number of places that I think are the typical places that many community people go, just because I haven't found my crew within them.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And when you were saying about how you're not a part of any community, I was just thinking like you're the part of the ultimate community, which is the on-deck alumni group, the mastermind group. So
it's a really wonderful group of people. It was very special for the period of time where it was a thing. Yeah,
totally. I love this. All right, Anthony, thank you so much for jumping on this call with me. This was such an amazing, insightful conversation, and I'm sure this will be super helpful for everybody listening who's going to want to follow your footsteps.
Thanks so much. It was really fun to be able to do it, and it's been cool to be on this side since I've learned so much from many of your past guests. So I appreciate you having me on. And I guess I would say we're at nextcareers.co. If anybody knows of the most talented person in their network who is startup focused and figuring out their next thing, just send our way. That's our crew.
Yeah, I'll do that. We'll put this in the show notes, and you can follow Anthony from the link in the show notes below, and check out Next Careers in the show notes again. So
cool.
Thanks so much.
Thanks so much. Have a great day.